Hello, welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Ankur Desai. On this episode, I'm joined by our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams. Paul, the UK has announced a multi-billion-dollar plan. That's in order to bring its armed forces in line with the future of warfare. So just tell us first up a little bit more about it.
The way the government frames this is in the midst of the largest investment in defence spending for decades. The problem is that they are working from a low base. The Prime Minister has said repeatedly that the armed forces have been hollowed out by decades of underinvestment, and at a time when everyone from the top of the military leadership on down is warning that this country is facing very real and growing threats that need to be addressed and quickly, with this general belief that Europe as a whole should be ready possibly to confront Russian forces within the next 5 years, which is a fairly, terrifying prospect.
And it's interesting, you touched upon Russia there, the Ukraine conflict. Let's also add in the Iranian conflict as well. How much have these conflicts been game changers in terms of how they use artificial intelligence, drones, and I guess these plans reflect the lessons that have been learned through those conflicts and what, let's say, the West needs to do in order to keep up to speed?
Yeah, they absolutely do. And, you wouldn't want to be a person drawing up any of these plans because, frankly, the moment the ink dries on your proposal, you're finding that some new technological development has, if not rendered your plans redundant, then at least, moved things on a bit. And that has been the absolute lesson learned in Ukraine. Drones have absolutely transformed everything from the smallest, cheapest drones to the largest, most sophisticated unmanned platforms, because drones is perhaps a subset. People talk about uncrewed or unmanned platforms, autonomous platforms, and that could be a tiny drone or a 100-foot long ship capable of launching missiles and all sorts of things. So what we're going to see in this new sort of vision of the military, at least the theory is, that we will have all of the three armed wings of the armed forces integrating this new technology along with AI, alongside existing kind of traditional platforms. So, unmanned vehicles alongside heavy armor, unmanned aircraft flying in conjunction with jets in the sky, and out at sea, the same thing applying. Now, there are a lot of people who are a little skeptical because a lot of this sounds pretty futuristic. We know from Ukraine that some of this is tried and tested, and that's a good place to start. But I think there are a lot of people who are nervous that perhaps the government is jumping into that particular line of thinking and perhaps sacrificing some more traditional concepts in the process. I mean, clearly there's going to have to be some kind of hybrid, and you hear that word all the time. And the details of that, I think, will take quite a while to emerge.
If we look beyond the UK then and NATO as a whole, how prepared is it then for this new type of warfare? I've seen some army generals saying that Vladimir Putin has looked at the West and thought, actually, there aren't many deterrents there. So therefore, he's sort of launched this war when he did.
Well, point number one, that didn't go so very well for him because he took a look at what he thought was a very weak enemy and turned out to be a far more enterprising and resilient than he could possibly have imagined. The ripple effects of 2022 and the full-scale invasion were felt initially, not surprisingly, in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Poland. These are countries that have hugely increased their defence spending, and they're the ones who have been sounding the alarm bells about Russian intentions most vociferously for some years now. I think part of the problem, the further you get from Eastern Europe, is the more remote it seems to the general public. Defence chiefs here in the UK have been talking about these dangers and illustrating these dangers for some time now, but it still feels, I think, to the general public, a slightly remote threat. The fact that there are Russian vessels out at sea hovering over undersea cables or sabotage operations being mounted by disaffected teenagers sponsored by Russian handlers in various parts of Europe. All of these things feel like irritants, but they don't feel like a kind of imminent threat. And I think that is part of the problem that the government has, because the one thing that the general public is concerned about is the cost of living, welfare, and all of these sorts of things, potholes in the roads. Russian threats seem a bit theoretical by comparison. And so the government is juggling these priorities and depending on, what side of the fence you're on, not quite finding the right balance. But Europe definitely is rising to the challenge. All the European NATO members are now, in fact, all NATO members have met the 2% of GDP, which was an earlier NATO target. Some of them are well beyond that. Poland is at 4.3%, Lithuania 4%, the UK currently 2.31%. Germany has just overtaken the UK at 2.39%. And then you've got countries like Spain and Portugal lagging some way behind. Of course, Donald Trump wants his
closer to 5%, right?
Indeed. And that's that's 3.5% on core defence spending, plus another 1.5% on sort of resilience, national infrastructure, the kind of wider security picture. And the government says that it intends to meet that target and that the latest pledges on spending are nudging us in the direction of that. I think the government's critics argue we're not really seeing a timetable for meeting any of these ambitious targets. The targets are being discussed, but they're not convinced that the government has really got a plan to meet those targets.
And with Donald Trump insisting on countries to meet that 5% GDP target in terms of spending on defence, are you seeing countries are pushing quickly towards that target, or are NATO countries still feeling as though they will do it at their own pace? They're not going to be put under pressure by the US?
Yeah, I mean, there are some countries like Spain who are, actively resisting American pressure in all sorts of ways. I think most people would say Donald Trump has, in a way, done the Europeans a favour by being pretty brutal about this and by basically telling the Europeans, look, you've been freeloading on American goodwill since the end of the Second World War. The time has come for you to look after security in your continent. That is now an entirely accepted mantra across Europe. We're hearing European leaders talking about essentially becoming the main drivers of NATO, the main funders of NATO, the main organisers of NATO, thinking possibly of a time when maybe the United States decides NATO is not really its business anymore and it's more interested in, the Pacific arena. So there's a very real sense across Europe that the countries of Europe, the EU and Britain and others, need to be taking more responsibility for their own security. And I mean, that is an important part of Donald Trump's legacy. Of course, he's not going to be here in a couple of years' time. And who knows, the war in Ukraine may eventually fizzle out. And this notion of a kind of rapacious, dangerous Russia could start to fade. Right now, we're living through the period where there's sort of maximum perceived danger. Who knows what the world would look like in 5 years' time?
Yeah, as you alluded to that point about that Russian threat in 5 years' time, could this also be NATO preparing for a possible war in the future and just having deterrence in place? We saw recently reports come out of North Korea that they are arming themselves, with nuclear technology. People always worry about threats from, further afield because there are opportunities because of the sophisticated nature of technology moving so quickly that there could be threats from so far away to countries, on the other side of the world. So is this a sign of preparation rather than prediction of some sort of a conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about deterrence. Yes, you're right. I mean, North Korea, I think, has ballistic missiles capable of hitting the American mainland. Question marks about its ability to stick nuclear weapons on top of these. But we don't talk a great deal about North Korea at the moment, but it's certainly a continuing threat. We saw moments during the Iran war where its ability to launch ballistic missiles much further than people had thought possible. So that there was a realization there that that was a danger. But all the focus really is on Russia. and on Vladimir Putin and on the kind of the rhetoric surrounding the war in Ukraine, and the sense that if you look around Europe and you kind of start to tally up these various hybrid dangers, exploding parcels in a DHL warehouse, which could have blown up on an aircraft, Russian warships hovering over and inspecting, vital undersea cables and so forth. These are the kind of dangers that people are identifying. I don't think outside of Poland and the Baltics, you have a lot of governments thinking, oh my God, Russia is about to invade on the ground. But we need to be in a position to deter that and any other of the more kind of hybrid threats that Russia is demonstrating on an almost daily basis.
Paul Adams there, our diplomatic correspondent. If you like more content from the Global News Podcast, do remember to click on the link below. Thank you ever so much for your company, and we'll see you on the next episode.